In the morning, a large black Cadillac pulls up to a garage in the northern part of the city. This place is used as a warehouse by the gang of Bugs Moran, a notable Chicago gangster. 4 men exit the car, holding automatic weapons, with 2 of them dressed in police uniforms. At this moment, there are 7 people in the garage. They are awaiting a delivery of illegal alcohol. Seeing people in uniform at the threshold, the gangsters believe it is another law enforcement raid, a common practice of the Prohibition era. The men in uniform order all members of Bugs Moran's gang to face the wall. Unexpectedly, the police open fire with their automatic weapons. 7 men by the wall fall dead. Reporters arriving on the scene witness the bloodbath. This cold-blooded murder will go down in history as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The crime remains unsolved. It is still not entirely clear who was responsible and what the motive was. But back then, in the year 1929, the majority of Chicago's residents, and indeed the entire country, had little doubt. This was the work of Al Capone, the most famous gangster. He was credited with several hundred murders, ranging from major contract killings to personally dealing with a rival using a bat. In addition, there was racketeering in illegal casinos, brothels, and of course, rivers of illegal alcohol. It seemed a logical criminal record for the number one criminal, but it's not that simple. Many accounts of Al Capone's crimes were either half-truths or complete lies. This story is largely about how the name became a myth, to such an extent that today, few remember the truth. It's fascinating to learn how it really was. How a young man from a poor immigrant family rose in just a few years to become the king of the criminal world, and then just as swiftly destroyed his own greatness. To understand how the name Al Capone became a legend, one could cite Google search statistics, the number of mentions in the media and popular culture. But a much more telling aspect of the gangster's mythologization is a small detail. Even his own grandchildren refer to him not as Granddad, but as Al Capone. It's hard to find another character in history whose myth has so far surpassed the real person. Well, let's start by unraveling one from the other. The gangster's name is primarily associated with Chicago, but our protagonist arrived in this city as an adult due to an unfortunate accident. In reality, the story begins in New York. There, in the late 19th century, a young family arrives with 2 small sons. The surname Capone is common in the Naples area of Italy, and among the numerous Italian immigrants in America of that period, there were many Capones. But the surname would become world-famous thanks to one family. Gabriel and Teresa are around 30. They settle with their children in a cheap neighborhood in Brooklyn among other Italian expatriates. Initially, the father struggles with heavy, low-paying jobs, eventually finding his niche in the barber profession and opening his own salon. It does not bring him great wealth, but in the future, it allows him to more or less support a large family of 9 children, 7 of whom will be born on American soil. The middle child will be a boy named Alphonse. This is the year 1899. Italians in America at the turn of the century are not necessarily second-class citizens, but they are often associated with dirty, hard and unskilled labor. Naturally, his heritage greatly influences Capone's future, and he will often repeat with some irritation throughout his life, "I'm not Italian, I was born in Brooklyn." In the early 20th century, the offspring of large Italian immigrant families scarcely fit into small apartments, thus spending most of their time outside the home. On the streets, the Capone brothers quickly Americanized their Italian names, and Alphonse becomes simply Al. Capone's father works hard not only because he has 9 children to feed, but also understanding that without money, his sons will drop out of school and end up earning on the streets, most likely through crime. Al Capone, it should be noted, does quite well in school. His main strengths are in mathematics, English, and communicating with classmates. These skills will prove to be extremely useful for the future mobster. His income converted to modern values would be in the billions of dollars. His English will significantly aid in communication with reporters, and his ability to build relationships will allow him to create a vast underground empire. So if you're still in school watching this video, study well. It will be useful in life. Capone, however, despite his parents' efforts and educational success, drops out of school at about 14 years of age and goes to work. His older brothers had done the same before him. The eldest, Jimmy, set out to conquer Hollywood, but never made it, vanishing and reappearing only 30 years later. The two following brothers, Ralph and Frank, almost immediately became involved in crime. Al, unlike them, began with quite legitimate jobs, like working at a printing factory. Since all life in Italian neighborhoods at that time takes place outside, everyone knows what their neighbors are doing and how they live. By the age of 15, Al Capone is known as a friendly but unremarkable teenager, not engaged in any illegal activities. After he becomes the king of the mafia, many legends will arise about how Al, even as a teenager, expertly fought with sailors, harshly dealt with his Irish peers, and even beat a teacher. In reality, the story about the sailors is a complete fabrication. Clashes between Italians and Irish in New York at that time are a common occurrence, and Capone likely participated in them sometimes, but did not beat anyone half to death. The incident with the teacher seemingly did occur, but the details range from a mere altercation to a harsh knockdown in which the teacher was floored by a blow from his student. Considering the mythologization of our protagonist, I lean towards a less spectacular version. In a sense, it is Capone's father who introduces him to crime. He sends him to work as a shoe shiner on a bustling street in Brooklyn. There, the teenager observes how local authorities manage small businesses, and a business plan forms in his mind. Capone begins racketeering, collecting tribute from the boys who shine shoes in the area, supposedly offering them protection. The business begins to expand, and Capone already recruits assistants to control even more shoe shiners. The enterprise develops quite rapidly. Capone has no real power yet, and local gangsters squeeze out Alphonse's business. However, his talent does not go unnoticed. The well-known authority Johnny Torrio offers Capone a job. Every newcomer hired by Torrio undergoes a psychological test. They were invited to the boss's office and left alone for a short time. At the same time, money lay on the leader's desk. Those who resisted the temptation and did not pocket a single bill were given a chance to work in the organization. Capone passes the test, and so begins his criminal career. The story of Capone and Torrio is a vivid example of how the student not only surpasses the teacher, but also completely eclipses him in history. At the beginning of the last century, Torrio is considered a mafia genius. He simultaneously manages large groups in two cities, New York and Chicago. At the early stages, Capone is merely an errand boy delivering messages, nothing criminal. However, the income is several times more than he could earn shining shoes. The teenager reliably brings all the money home. Nonetheless, one should not be misguided. Although Al Capone is not directly involved at the time, he cannot be unaware of what Johnny Torrio is really engaged in, and that includes the full array: brothels, racketeering, extortion, and murders. Gradually, Capone is entrusted with increasingly responsible tasks. Exactly when young Al fully turned to the dark side is unknown. The data from numerous biographers varies on this point. Some claim that by 18, he already had several murders to his account. Others say that the most he did was collect proceeds from the brothels owned by the boss. What can be asserted with certainty is that by 20, Capone is no longer limited to just delivering messages and collecting money. Personal circumstances are not the least of reasons. At first, 18-year-old Al meets a girl named Mary Coughlin, or May. She works at a box factory. Capone works there too. At that time, he still maintains a legal job for cover. For May, Capone is not an obvious boyfriend. She is from a more educated and affluent family, a couple of years older than him and ultimately Irish. They plan to marry in 1918. Due to the tense relations between the Italian and Irish communities in New York at the beginning of the last century, such unions are not particularly encouraged by either society or the church. However, by the time of the wedding, the couple already had a 1-month-old son named Albert, so neither society nor the church really had much of a choice. May was far from the first girl in Capone's life. By the age of 20, he already had considerable sexual experience. Working in the numerous brothels owned by his boss did not pass without consequence. At 16, Al contracted gonorrhea for the first time, and at 20, syphilis. He would transmit this to his young wife, and through her to their newborn son, who would suffer from numerous health problems from an early age. Capone's sexual life became even more active after marriage. However, Alphonse saw no conflict of interest here. It was all reminiscent of classic Hollywood mafia movies. The wife was akin to a Madonna, a mother holding a special status and position. Numerous mistresses, most of whom were prostitutes, constituted a separate part of his life, one that did not intersect with his family. May was likely aware of her young husband's criminal activities, though not necessarily of his affairs with prostitutes, and certainly not of the gift of syphilis. This was not the only information Capone withheld from his wife. It was unlikely that he shared the quick tale behind his famous scar. The scar on his face was perhaps Capone's main visual trademark, even more iconic than his famous hat. Scarface was one of Al's nicknames, as well as the title of several famous films inspired by his biography. To begin with, it was not one scar, but 3. The story of how he got them is somewhat shrouded in mystery, but the most frequently cited version goes like this. Before his marriage, Capone had an altercation in a bar. He supposedly told an unfamiliar Italian woman that she had a nice backside. Her slightly drunk brother did not appreciate the compliment, and a fight ensued. During the altercation, Al's opponent either broke a bottle or drew a knife and slashed his face. Knowing Capone, one can assume that the offender did not live long after the incident. However, it turned out that he was a member of the same gang. The parties quickly brushed the conflict under the carpet, but the vivid scar remained for life. A year after the wedding, Capone's father died of a heart attack. One of the older brothers had already disappeared, and the other 2, despite their constant involvement in the criminal community, were not cut out to lead the family or provide for their mother and numerous younger relatives. At 21, Capone found himself responsible for 2 families he needed to care for, and there was no time for a low-paid legal job at a box factory. The only path to serious money was advancement in the criminal world, and Capone's boss was ready to help. Besides carrying out occasional assignments, which almost certainly included murders, Al worked as a bartender and bouncer in one of Notorious' establishments. During one of his routine trips to collect proceeds from the brothels, Capone had an altercation with a patron. Al beat him nearly to death. The victim turned out to be a representative of a rival Irish gang. Its leader promises to avenge the insult with murder. As punishment, and for safety reasons, Boss Capone sends him to work in Chicago, where Johnny Torrio also has an impressive organization. This is how Al Capone ends up in the city, where it will only take him 6 years to become the king of the criminal world, and another 6 to sit at the top, and then abruptly lose it all. Initially, Capone's duties in Chicago are the same as in New York. He collects money from brothels and works as a bouncer at his boss's establishments. Al, with his wife and son, rents a modest apartment. By that time, May is already aware that her husband frequently associates with prostitutes, but they have not yet become his permanent mistresses. Simply because the young member of the criminal organization does not have much money, it's hard to say how the fate of the most famous gangster would have unfolded and whether he would have even earned that title if not for one historical event. In January 1920, an unusual robbery occurred in the United States. Initially, it seemed quite ordinary. A group of people cleaned out a train, but their target was not gold bars or money, but something equally valuable at that time: whiskey. Shortly before that, a new amendment appeared in the US Constitution, which would become known as the Prohibition. The sale and production of alcohol in the country were banned. The next decade would change many aspects of life across the nation, and of course the biography of our hero. For who he became, Al Capone was largely indebted to Prohibition. Soon, Chicago became the epicenter of bloody showdowns between corrupt politicians and dirty cops. For almost every day over a decade, residents would read in the newspapers about another murder, a warehouse robbery involving illegal alcohol, clashes between rival gangs and other crimes. According to researchers of that period, approximately 700 murders connected to local gang showdowns occurred in Chicago during the 1920s, and Capone was behind nearly a third of those crimes. But we'll talk more about that later. Our hero's first truly responsible occupation becomes managing the financial operations of his boss's enterprises. He is responsible for accounting and tax evasion. Capone's income significantly increases, and despite continuing to work in brothels, he tries to publicly distance himself from this activity. Capone presents himself as a respectable businessman, dresses well, and prints business cards with fictitious names. One of his most famous pseudonyms is Al Brown. It is Al Brown who will run the furniture enterprise which our hero uses as a legal business front. Another area of Capone's responsibility is relationships with politicians. In other words, bribery. Corruption among authorities nationwide surged after the enactment of Prohibition, but Chicago officials were particularly notorious for their venality. In short, the scheme of the mafia's relationship with the city's authorities can be described as follows. We give you money and help you get elected, in return for nothing but to turn a blind eye when we conduct our affairs. By affairs, beyond the usual brothels, casinos, and racketeering, we primarily mean the production and distribution of alcohol. Bribes to politicians are given by Capone through his brother Frank, and this is an especially interesting detail. Firstly, Al brings both of his elder brothers, Ralph and Frank, to work with him in Chicago. Secondly, this highlights the cunning specificity of Capone's business. Throughout his career, he conducted all his illegal activities through others, which ultimately left prosecutors, years later, with nothing to charge the gangster with for murders, racketeering, brothels, or bribery. And although Capone seems to manage political games well, they once turned into a great tragedy. In the year 1924, local elections take place in Chicago. Capone needs a victory for a loyal Republican candidate to successfully continue his underground business. But everything points to a victory for the Democratic opponent. Al, along with his brother Frank and other gang members, arrives at the necessary polling station and literally forces the voters to make the right choice. Tensions rise, and the police are called to the scene. For some reason, they arrive in an unmarked car. As they approach, they almost run over Frank Capone crossing the street. He automatically pulls out a weapon. The police officers in the car perceive this as a signal to attack, and a shooting ensues. Frank and a few other gang members die in the gunfight. Thus, a combination of absurd accidents leads to a great personal tragedy for Al Capone. Apparently, he simply did not know that ballots could be quietly stuffed. The next few years probably become the most dangerous for Capone. Disputes between city gangs are in full swing. The Notorious gang, which includes Capone, is called the Outfit. The organization, consisting mainly of people with Italian roots, was formed even before the introduction of Prohibition, but those years will become the peak of its development. At that time, the Outfit is one of the main gangs in the city. They control hundreds of speakeasies, dozens of brothels and casinos. Notorious and Capone, as the leaders of the gang, become logical targets for elimination by competitors. The first attempt on Capone's life occurs at the beginning of the year 1925. The restaurant where Al stops for lunch is shot at from a passing car. He survives, as do the other patrons. The parked cars nearby take the main damage. But this incident is also interesting because, if not the first, it is at least one of the first experiences of using a Thompson submachine gun in gang conflicts. From then on, they will use this weapon more frequently, and it will remain in history as an integral attribute of mafia confrontations during Prohibition. A few weeks later, a new attempt occurs. This time, the target is Notorious. He is less fortunate than Capone. The assassins lay in wait for Notorious near his house, and after firing several shots, drive away, thinking the authority figure is already dead. However, he manages to survive. After being discharged from the hospital, Notorious decides to retire, and in the year 1925, the head of the Outfit becomes the 26-year-old Al Capone. The next 6 years will become his moment of glory. A few years prior, Capone had purchased a house in Chicago in a decent middle-class neighborhood. Besides his wife and son, Al's mother and his younger relatives lived there. Since becoming the head of the Outfit, Capone could easily afford much more luxurious real estate. Yet this place would remain his only home in Chicago. In other aspects, Capone spared no expense. His flamboyant style of dressing would forever remain in history. A hat and expensive suits at $5,000 each, which by today's standards is 10 times more. Moreover, Al might order as many as 20 sets from the tailor at once. Some of his suits could be lime or lavender or deep banana-colored. In short, a lot of money does not always come with good taste. Capone's generosity was not limited to his personal expenses: expensive clothing and jewelry for his wife, gifts to relatives and acquaintances, and the distribution of money to completely random people. According to legend, once the gangster bought an entire batch of newspapers from an unfamiliar boy selling them. And there are numerous such stories. Even if some part of them is fictional, the general picture is still clear. Later, Capone would organize even more generous acts of charity. For example, he would set up a free kitchen for the unemployed. Overall, it is not surprising that in the 1920s, in the eyes of many, Gangster Number One appears as a people's benefactor, rather than a cold-blooded killer and mafioso. For the headquarters of his organization, Al rents several floors in a good hotel. But not because he's a fan of free breakfasts and round-the-clock concierge service, but because it is a convenient place for conducting his type of business. It's convenient for meeting with partners and lovers, throwing lavish parties, and setting up round-the-clock security at every corner. Another safety measure becomes the automobile. Capone buys an expensive armored Cadillac with bulletproof glass. Sometimes the gangster would not come home for months and communicate with his family exclusively by telephone if the threat of assassination attempts was too great. These security measures don't seem superfluous, considering that after the first shooting in the year 1925, there would be at least 12 attempts to kill Capone, all of them unsuccessful. The outfit group was already a large and efficient organization before Capone's leadership. But it is Al who will turn it into a vast underground empire. The business will be so well organized that years later it will be studied by economists from Harvard University. At the head of the organization is Capone himself. Under him, a board of directors consisting of 12 people, each is responsible for their own sector: brothels, casinos, alcohol, and so on. One of the directors, incidentally, was Capone's own brother, Ralph. Following the directors are hundreds of lower-ranking operatives, and together they form a complex and sprawling structure. Nevertheless, Capone himself has no direct connection to either illegal activities or financial flows. The numbers speak most vividly about the business's effectiveness. In the latter half of the 1920s, the branch would control up to 70% in various areas of Chicago's underground business. The total revenue would exceed $100 million per year, which is over $1 billion today. A significant portion of this amount comes from illegal production and distribution of alcohol known as bootlegging, which flourishes due to bribes, murders of competitors, and society's permissive attitude. At the same time, the media is developing rapidly. Newspapers, radio, and newsreels shown before films will actively cover the activities of the charismatic gangster. Gradually, Capone will become the first mafia superstar in history, not only in the United States, but also beyond its borders. The first event that attracts significant press attention to Capone occurs in the year 1926. A young prosecutor, McSwiggan, known for publicly promising to imprison the number one gangster, is killed in Chicago. However, that did not prevent the prosecutor from occasionally spending time with well-known mafiosi, including Capone. By the time of McSwiggan's murder, Al's reputation is such that for any serious crime in the city, the authorities first think of him. However, despite all law enforcement efforts, they fail to find any connection between Capone and the crime. Gradually, the king of Chicago's underground world realizes that the press can be controlled. To some extent, even before the advent of social media, Capone understands the importance of building a personal brand. He starts paying journalists. This approach, already tested on politicians and police officers, is now applied to the media. Bought journalists emphasize Capone's charitable initiatives in their articles, and vividly described the moral suffering of an innocent, falsely accused, law-abiding citizen of Chicago who is suddenly blamed for horrible crimes. Sometimes mafiosi invite members of the press to their homes, where they are greeted by Al in a robe with a good-natured smile. He portrays himself as an ordinary family man who, of course, never killed anyone, and whose relatives are very displeased to read the numerous slanders in the newspapers. At the same time, murders in the city continue, despite Capone's attempts to negotiate with other authorities and clearly divide spheres of influence in the city. He remains the main target for elimination, especially considering his growing influence and fame. One of Capone's main rivals throughout his career in Chicago was Joe Aiello, a figurehead of the Sicilian Mafia. Joe organized several assassination attempts against Al, the most famous of which involved rivers of blood and shattered skulls. Here's how it went. After several failed attempts, Aiello once again ordered a hit on his old enemy. The reward was $50,000, which is over $500,000 today. Candidates were quickly found. Two experienced hitmen who had previously worked mostly for Capone. A mutual acquaintance warned Al about the impending assassination and revealed the names of the hired men. Capone invited the killers to dinner. He knew that they did not yet know that he knew. Ultimately, Capone grabbed a baseball bat and smashed the heads of the hired men, to the horror of the mobster's guards who had seen it all. The story is vivid and dramatic, not necessarily true, but dramatic. There's no documentary evidence of this event. It is only known that the bodies of the killers were found in their car. But the nature of the wounds is unclear. The whole story resembles a snowball, where with each retelling in the subsequent books or films about Capone, new contentious details were added, and the final version became too far from the truth. Yes, it is most likely that Capone was behind the murder. Most likely because they had taken a contract on him. But that he personally carried it out is highly unlikely. Al was always very careful in this regard. For example, he never publicly spoke ill of his competitors and did not mention similar things in correspondence, all to ensure that he could not be easily implicated. And this approach worked. Officially, Capone is not guilty of any murder to this day. Therefore, it's hard to believe in a bloody revenge with a bat. The one who ordered Capone, Joe Aiello, would be killed in the year 1930. Who was most likely behind it, you can guess. In the year 1928 in Chicago, there were another elections, and this time the conflicts reached a new level. Candidates were sent packages with bombs, candidates were shot on the doorsteps of their homes, and primarily those who were displeasing to Al Capone. And here, of course, a logical question arises. Okay, let's assume in case of contract killings, reaching the client is very difficult, but what about everything else? Bribery, illegal alcohol, underground casinos? Could the police and prosecutors not find any evidence of Al Capone's involvement and imprison him? Surprisingly, no. Although everyone understood everything perfectly. And there are two main reasons: corruption and public indifference. Let's start with the first. In the complex structure of Al Capone's syndicate, hundreds of people were involved. Every underground brewery, every bar or casino kept detailed records. Without this, the business could not function. And even despite Capone's attempts to sweep away all traces linking him to criminal activity, surely they could be discovered. Bookkeeping records, witnesses, and so on. But the problem is the following. Capone had a vast number of police, prosecutors, and judges on his payroll. Suppose during another raid on a bar, law enforcement officers seized valuable documentation. First, Capone's people would try to buy off the lower-ranking police officer. If he turned out to be principled, they would go to his superior and continue up the chain to the judge. At some stage, there was a person who could either be bought or intimidated. Al Capone once confessed to a journalist that if he were imprisoned, the economy of Chicago would collapse. So many people in the city depended on his business and bribes. In the year 1927, even the Vice President of the United States acknowledged that the authorities were unable to do anything about the gangster. The second factor of Al Capone's untouchability was popular love, or at least indulgence. Prohibition turned out to be an interesting experiment, but an unsuccessful one. Not only did the law itself have various loopholes, for instance the sale of alcohol for medical or religious purposes, but the ban itself was not taken seriously by many. Capone, who helped ordinary workers have a drink after a hard day, appeared quite legitimately positive. Incidentally, it was the workers, not the highbrow elites, who brought in the majority of revenue from the production and distribution of alcohol. In the eyes of the common people, Al Capone managed to maintain the reputation of a benefactor rather than a bloodthirsty gangster for quite some time. To this day, one can come across recollections from Capone's own employees, such as cooks or waiters, who remember Al with only kind words. How they separated one thing from the other in their heads is unclear. Journalists, although they understood what the king of the mafia represented, found his influence too great. Many either received money from him or attended his luxurious parties, which could last several days without a break. Illegal alcohol flowed liberally, and among the guests one could encounter high-ranking representatives of law enforcement, politicians and stars of show business and sports. Al felt so above the law that he openly admitted in an interview with a journalist that he was a bootlegger. At the same time, he expressed outrage at why all those who walked around consuming his alcohol were not criticized. "When I sell alcohol, they call it bootlegging. When I serve alcohol to important gentlemen on a silver tray, they call it hospitality," a famous quote from the Gangster. To further understand the extent of Al Capone's notoriety by the early 1930s, here are a couple of statistical facts. Between 1929 and 1931, 5 biographies of the gangster were published. At that time, Capone was just turning 30 years old. Around the same time, Hollywood released the film Scarface based on Capone's story. However, the remake in 1983 with Al Pacino would become significantly more famous. It creates the impression that, in the second half of the 1920s, Al Capone was indeed untouchable. And it is highly likely that this impression even arises in the mind of the gangster himself, which to some extent explains his soon rapid downfall. Among the meticulous researchers of the mobster's biography, there are several versions regarding when irreversible cracks began appearing in the once unshakable foundation of his power. However, all theories fall within a couple of years, from 1928 to 1930. By that time, Al Capone had already bought a house in the southern state of Florida. Unlike Chicago, it is warm and sunny there all year round. Capone moved his wife and son to the new place while he spent the winter season there. He remotely managed his enormous syndicate during such periods. When the notorious St. Valentine's Day massacre occurred in Chicago in February of the year 1929, Capone was in Florida. The gang of Bugs Moran, whose members were gunned down, had been competing with Capone's group in several business areas for years, so few doubted who the ultimate beneficiary of the crime was. Not that similar mass crimes had never happened in the criminal underworld before, but the St. Valentine's Day massacre was the breaking point for public indifference. This was primarily due to the power of the media. The brutal photographs from the crime scene shock even nearly a century later. The slaughtered bodies and rivers of blood can easily be found online. At that time, many began to demand that the main perpetrator be held accountable, and by perpetrator, they meant Capone. But even under the pressure of public opinion, the investigation reached a dead end. Every possible piece of evidence led nowhere. The police offered a reward of $60,000 for information, but even this didn't help. In some sense, Capone was truly untouchable. Around the same time, the young director of the recently formed FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, decided to implement a new concept in the fight against mafia bootleggers. The idea was simple, yet somewhat genius. If organized crime was a business, it needed to be fought with business methods. First and foremost, look for unpaid taxes. Mafia bosses lived lavishly and did not hide it. At the same time, no one paid taxes, which was generally logical as the income was illegal. Shortly before this, a new provision had been introduced into American tax law. The obligation to pay taxes arose even on illegal income. This quite interesting system functions to this day. In the United States, there are numerous illegal immigrants who live and work without any rights or documents, yet they diligently pay taxes. They know very well whom not to mess with, and that is the tax authorities. Capone was in a difficult situation, being pressured from two sides. Firstly, the authorities with their tax claims carrying the threat of prison. Secondly, conflicts with other mafia communities, threatening murder. Capone was disliked by many criminal bosses, both because he was earning a lot, which incited envy, and because he was too much in the spotlight. Among the authorities, publicity was not highly valued. Al Capone knew that they planned to eliminate him, and that this would happen at the upcoming major gathering of mafiosi in Atlantic City in the year 1929. Criminal bosses from all over the country would come there, essentially to divide the United States into spheres of influence. Capone allegedly plans to step down shortly after this. Al settles on a plan that several crime lords before him have successfully executed to evade the potential threat of assassination, namely going to jail. Briefly for some minor offence, and of course to a decent correctional facility where he would feel right at home. Capone chooses a pleasant prison not far from Atlantic City. After the conclusion of the conference, he and his partner are arrested by the police for carrying weapons in public. The officer, of course, is on the payroll, and the arrest is merely a theatrical performance. Capone typically did not carry weapons, his bodyguards always did. The mafia leader's plan works out, but with significant amendments. The judge gives him a hefty fine and a year of imprisonment instead of the few months Al had hoped for, and in a real prison with horrifying conditions. It will take the gangster's lawyers a couple of months to appeal, and only after that is Capone transferred to a more comfortable facility. There his wife visits him frequently, and from there he manages his affairs in Chicago. He would even dine on meals from the best Italian restaurants nearby while in prison. He will leave prison having gained weight. While serving his sentence, Capone reads Napoleon's biography. He sees the main tragedy of the French emperor in having missed the moment when he needed to exit the game. For Al Capone, the fate of this historical figure becomes a metaphor for his own life. Despite his status, money, and fame, the mafioso is tired, primarily of the constant threat of assassination. However, despite all desire, at that time, the option to exit the game is unavailable to Capone. Too many want his blood. In the 30s, Capone is effectively the underground mayor of Chicago. According to some reports, more than half of the city's police officers receive bribes from him. That is, he is not just above the law, he is the law. The mafioso himself is likely confident in this. He knows that the authorities have little to charge him with, if anything. Moreover, everything is bought and sold, police witnesses and judges. But to pay everyone, money is needed, and there is less of it. The Great Depression is starting in the country, and it primarily hits workers, the main clientele of bars, casinos and brothels. Capone's incomes are declining. At the same time, a consensus begins to form within the elites. It's time to imprison the main mafioso of Chicago. And if it is impossible to do so on murder or illegal alcohol distribution charges, then let it be for unpaid taxes. Thus, in Chicago, the infamous list of enemies of the people or enemies of the state appears, with Capone holding the honorary first place on this ranking. Additionally, a community of important elite representatives is established in the city, ready to support the fight against Capone not only morally, but also financially. Within the circles of the wealthy and educated, the main gangster has never been considered one of their own. The elites might attend his parties, drink his alcohol, and even take his bribes. But Capone never had the chance to become one of them. It wasn't about the amount of money he had, nor the way he earned it. Simply put, Capone remained forever a poorly educated, not very well-bred Italian from Brooklyn. At the end of the year 1930, charges of tax evasion were brought against two high-ranking members of the branch gang. Shortly thereafter, the same fate befell Ralph Capone. Unlike his brother, he was not as meticulous with his finances. They discovered large bank accounts in his name opened on fictitious people. It was clear that the noose around Capone's neck was gradually tightening, and the most intriguing question here is why he did nothing about it. He was a man who began his professional activity in the criminal world with financial operations. Here we have several possibilities. Firstly, Capone might have thought that he was too beloved by the common people to be given a lengthy prison sentence. It was then that he opened a free soup kitchen for the poor, whose numbers had grown significantly with the onset of the Great Depression. Secondly, unlike his brother and other members of the gang, Capone was always extremely careful about how he conducted his business. He didn't have bank accounts. All money in the form of bank checks was always transferred through intermediaries. He paid everything in cash, which is why he always carried a large bundle of money with him. His house in Chicago was registered to his mother, and the house in Florida to his wife. In all the financial records of the numerous enterprises of the branch, Capone's name was always ciphered in the form of abbreviations or codes. Based on this, both the number one gangster and his lawyers believed that even if the case went to trial, it would either fall apart there or Capone would receive a minor sentence, which he would serve in a comfortable prison, as had happened in his past. And perhaps it would have happened that way, but Capone was let down by his lawyers. In the future rapid downfall of the number one gangster, they would play a significant role. To put complex legal processes in simple terms, the primary question from the tax authorities was, where did the money come from, Capone? By all indications, you are not a poor man, and your numerous family lacks for nothing. However, you paid no taxes, which means you had no income. Initially, no charges were brought against Capone. Questions were simply asked. Al completely entrusted all processes to his lawyers, which likely became his main mistake. The response of the lawyers to the tax inquiries not only failed to clear Capone of suspicion, but ultimately simplified the prosecutor's task. The lawyers' replies partially confirmed Capone's connection to illegal financial flows. In short, by the middle of the year 1931, prison for Capone was almost inevitable, and the only relevant question was, how many years? Now let's delve into some legal details. They are important to understand what actually happened to the king of the mafia. So, Al Capone and his lawyers propose a deal to the prosecutors. The gangster will plead guilty to some charges, receive a couple of years in prison, and then move to permanent residence in Florida. Initially, it seems that the prosecutors are ready to accept the deal because, if the deal falls through, the case moves to a jury trial. Firstly, the guilt of the defendant would still have to be proven to the jury, and secondly, this isn't Chicago. The evidence might be useless, as the jurors could either be bought or intimidated. The prosecutors, who are building a tax evasion case against Capone, have a sensible point. At the same time, there is an attempt to charge the mobster under the so-called vagrancy statute, because if the accused didn't pay taxes and had no job, he should have been looking for one or applied for welfare, which Capone did not do. However, the case falls apart in court, and witnesses refuse to testify against the mobster. You can imagine why. In the middle of 1931, Capone comes to court to plead guilty to tax evasion, receive 2.5 years under the terms of the deal, and head to a prison resort. To the surprise of both the prosecution and defense, the judge refuses to accept the deal, meaning that a jury will determine guilt in open court sessions. In early October 1931, a trial begins in Chicago, which surely could claim the title of Show of the Decade. The sessions will drag on for several weeks, and not only the city but the national press will report on each of them in detail. The public will be in for colourful characters, unexpected turns, and a shocking finale. Here is how it all unfolded. An expanded list of jurors' names was known in advance. What do Capone's men do? Right, they buy most of them. A clever move, but expected. Shortly before the first session begins, the judge changes the entire jury panel and secludes the new ones in a hotel with lots of security and no contact with the outside world. In the first week of sessions, the ball is in the prosecution's court. Testimonies from key witnesses connected in some way to the gang's or Capone's cash flows are presented. Some of those testifying were under a witness protection program right up to the trial. Quite logical considering the defendant's personality. Prosecutors present the findings of their investigation, the main conclusion being over $140,000 in unpaid taxes over several years. Another trump card for the prosecution is the demonstration of Capone's exorbitant spending, supposedly as an unemployed man. And here begins the play for the audience, that is, the jury, most of whom are blue-collar workers with modest incomes. Witnesses describe the gangster's luxurious lifestyle, his cars, suits, parties, and even down to expensive silk underwear and $1,000-a-week food expenses. Keep in mind, the country is in the midst of the Great Depression at this time, with many having neither jobs nor money. In their arguments, prosecutors even mention the recent high-profile murder of a well-known crime journalist in Chicago, rumored to have been orchestrated by Capone. What relevance does this have to the tax case? None. But jurors are people too, and people are emotional beings. Then the defense comes into play. The lawyers could have explained that the requirement to declare illegal income only appeared in the year 1927. Yet the prosecutors presented data for the years 1925 and 1926. The lawyers could have argued that most of the evidence found during raids on establishments was invalid because the statute of limitations had expired. The lawyers might have emphasized that extravagant spending is not a crime, and the prosecutors poorly demonstrated proof of illegal income. But the lawyers did not do this. Instead, they presented numerous absurd arguments. For instance, they stated that everyone implicitly wants to hide their income and evade taxes. After hearing all sides, the jury delivered their verdict. They acquitted Capone on 17 out of 22 counts. However, the remaining 5 counts were sufficient for the judge to sentence Al Capone to an unprecedented 11 years in prison for tax charges. Half a century later, the American Bar Association would thoroughly analyze the details of this case and conclude that all the prosecutor's evidence could have been successfully dismantled by good legal work, possibly leading to the defendant's acquittal. But as the press noted in the year 1931, Capone's tax conviction was merely an excuse. The gangster himself was convinced that his downfall was due to excessive publicity. The appeal by the lawyers was predictably denied a year later, and at the age of 33, Capone went to serve his sentence. There are many legends regarding the conditions of Capone's imprisonment in Atlanta. Some inmates spoke of the gangster's luxurious life, restaurant-grade food, expensive bed linens, and even the pile of substances Capone allegedly consumed. Whether there is any truth to these stories is unknown. The information we know from documentary sources presents a completely different picture. The former mafia king lived the life of an ordinary prisoner. Most days he repaired shoes or cleaned floors. In his spare time, he was allowed to play in a musical group on the bass for good behavior, and Capone behaved remarkably well. This was his chance to significantly reduce his sentence, and likely Capone would have spent the rest of his days in prison this way. But US President Roosevelt proposed the idea of a special place for particularly dangerous criminals. The name of this correctional facility is known by everyone today, Alcatraz. After 2 years of imprisonment, the former number 1 mafioso was transferred to a prison on the island in San Francisco Bay. For Capone, this was the beginning of the end. On the outside, an era was passing. The Prohibition was repealed, and the criminal group's branch gradually lost its former grandeur. In Alcatraz, Capone was certainly not expecting a warm welcome. The prison was partly created to deprive dangerous criminals of any opportunity to live a comfortable lifestyle. Initially, the notoriety of the former number 1 gangster ensured his safety. Other inmates were afraid of Capone. However, they quickly learned that he is imprisoned for tax-related charges, not for murder or racketeering. There is also evidence that after this, Capone was assaulted. At least one attack is documented in medical records. An inmate stabbed Capone with scissors. The wounds turned out to be non-life-threatening. In Alcatraz, Capone's health sharply declines. Within a couple of years, he loses more than 20 kilograms. Upon his admission to his first prison in Atlanta, Alphonse is diagnosed with neurosyphilis. This is a stage of development where the disease begins to affect the brain. However, over several years in Alcatraz, the symptoms are not yet severe, so Capone does not receive any treatment. He continues to behave well, hoping for early release, and manages to get a promotion from shoe cobbler to prison librarian. Capone becomes interested in religion and reads books, one of which is called Life Begins at 40. Considering Capone's eventful biography, It is hard to believe that he arrived at Alcatraz at the age of 35. Visits from his wife are allowed only once a month. May sees her husband's worsening health condition and writes letters requesting his transfer to a facility with better conditions. However, only after 5 years in Alcatraz, these requests are granted. By then, doctors already note the serious impact of syphilis on Capone's brain. For instance, he might not reach his cell, or his speech sometimes slows down and he begins to mumble something incoherent. Occasionally, Capone simply raves. In the year 1939, he's transferred to a prison near Los Angeles with better living conditions. Less than a year later, Capone is released early. Immediately afterward, he is taken to a hospital where he receives adequate treatment for syphilis. According to the doctor, by the time of his admission, the disease had affected his brain so significantly that Capone's mental age was akin to that of a 7-year-old child. Treatment helps only slightly to improve the situation. According to the doctor's prognosis, with proper care, Capone could live quite long, up to an advanced age. However, it is impossible to fundamentally correct the already formed brain issues. Capone will continue to periodically rave, talking to deceased people among other things. At times he becomes aggressive and unmanageable. All of this is also a result of the disease. Newspapers printed sensational headlines claiming that the former gangster #1 was utterly insane and detached from reality. This was when the story emerged about the deranged mobster allegedly sitting with a fishing rod by the pool of his home in Florida trying to catch fish, thinking he was on a pier. The story is nothing more than a myth, and the famous photo of Capone with a fishing rod and a cigar was indeed taken during a fishing trip on a pier, where Capone was taken by his brother Ralph. The former mobster certainly suffered from the effects of neurosyphilis, but this manifested more as periodic incidents rather than him having completely lost his mind. Despite the doctor's conclusion that Capone's mental faculties would never recover, his wife and many family members continued to believe that he would soon get better and return to leading the criminal organization. The relatives were likely engaged in self-delusion. As Al Capone had long ceased participating in the gang's activities, and the influence of his brother had also significantly waned, the family faced financial difficulties. The former gang provided Capone with money, but it was barely enough for basic needs. This presents an intriguing point. In other words, his wife and other relatives were so unwilling to give up their comfortable lifestyle that they eagerly awaited Capone's return to his professional activities, fully understanding what he was involved in. Incidentally, this fact also refutes the numerous rumors of Capone possessing vast wealth. By the time of his death, he would be almost penniless. After the mobster's release from prison, an unexpected family event occurred. His older brother Jimmy, who had been unheard of for 30 years, suddenly reappeared. It turned out he had set off to conquer Hollywood to star in cowboy films, but never made it and settled in the western part of the country, adopting the pseudonym Richard Hart. There is a belief that he was the only brother of the Capone clan to remain on the right side of the law, but this is not entirely true. Jimmy indeed served as a sheriff and ironically fought against bootleggers, but not everything in his life was smooth. Despite Jimmy and his family claiming he served in Europe during World War I, there are no records of this, although it is known he faced several theft charges. Jimmy Capone ultimately decided to return to his family because he ran out of money, and it was his only option. In his final phase of life, after being released from prison, the once main mobster Al Capone lived like a very elderly man, though he was only in his mid-40s. Alphonse tended to the garden, swam in the pool, and fished, while his brain was gradually overcome by dementia. Capone spent all his time surrounded by loved ones as he required constant care. In early 1947, Alphonse Capone's heart failed amid developing pneumonia. The criminal dynasty ended there. Capone's only son, Albert, would not be involved in crime, instead entering the restaurant business, albeit not very successfully. When Albert decided to borrow money from his father's former gang, they refused. Initially, Al Capone's life seemed like an exciting movie. Shootouts, bootlegging, political intrigues, and criminal wars. What we are accustomed to seeing in classic gangster films, most of which, incidentally, are inspired by Capone's own image. The mobsters are almost always there, in hats, suits, and with cigars clenched between their teeth. But the real story of Gangster #1 is more of a complex drama from Martin Scorsese's filmography. The main character chooses a relatively simple and quick path to success through crime. However, the ladder he climbs actually goes downward. The further he moves, the deeper and darker it becomes, and retribution inevitably awaits the hero at the end.